Well, this was a powerful combination. And it was not only powerful because of the capabilities they brought, but they adopted a sophisticated strategy. Early in the insurgency, they began to attack certainly coalition forces. But then they also understood that it was important to create, to exacerbate and perpetuate local grievances, so that there was this sort of this pool of discontent, disgruntlement on which to draw recruits, and again to give them the opportunity to operate freely, and then, of course, then to blame all of the consequences of attacks on infrastructure and so forth on the coalition forces rather than on themselves, who conducted these attacks. We then adopted a strategy that was basically aimed to rapidly transition to a sovereign Iraqi government and then rapidly build Iraqi security forces, neglecting the police based on ineptitude and lack of capacity within the CPA. Ultimately, that became a military responsibility, but trying to build beyond the Walt Slocum plan security forces much faster in the form of the ICDC, which was really a stopgap. In retrospect, should have probably been a gendarme, a stronger national institution that was more closely coupled with the army, but then to rapidly transition security responsibilities to Iraqi forces. This was a grave danger to the insurgency because, as Professor Hoffman pointed out, that once police are capable, credible, legitimate, have access to intelligence, the insurgency has nowhere to go. So they shifted their attacks, the enemy did, on these nascent security forces, and were able to essentially disintegrate many of these security forces before they possessed the resiliency to stand up to those sorts of attacks. We saw those attacks growing in number and intensity in the fall and into the winter of 2003 to 2004, at which point the enemy began to shift their strategy again. As we became occupied mainly in Baghdad and in Al Anbar province, and Fallujah in particular in the summer of 2004, the enemy looked at Nineveh province as a way to really prosecute this shift in their strategy, and this was articulated clearly in the Zarqawi letter that was captured, I think, December of 03, early 04, to incite sectarian violence, create a chaotic condition in which the insurgency could operate freely, allow them to establish control of certain areas of the country, used as a base for insurgent and terrorist operations more broadly through the country, ensured that this nascent government could not even fulfill its primary responsibility, which is security of the people, undermine the coalition effort to build representative government in the country, and then set conditions for a civil war, a full-scale civil war that would occur as soon as U.S. forces withdraw. And what they have in mind is the Afghanistan model after the Soviet withdrawal. They would then support those who shared their view in terms of their Salafist, Takfirist ideology, and try to take over a portion of the country. Now, obviously, the Baathists didn't share that particular agenda, but they had suppressed those different goals so they could effect this alliance of convenience and work together in the short term. Western Nineveh province was a perfect place for them to come. First, because it gave them access to external support into Syria, and second, because of the ethnic and the sectarian dynamics within the region that sort of set conditions for inciting that sectarian violence. They embarked on a campaign to do that. They took outlying areas in the summer of 2004 and then focused on the town of Tal Afar, where you have a Turkmen population is divided between Sunni and Shia, 25% Shia, 75% Sunni, about the same demographic except for Arabs as a town like Samarra, sound familiar, Balad, Bakuba. They operate in these mixed ethnic sectarian areas, get a portion of the population to regard them as patrons and protectors, invite them in essentially, and then they jumpstart a cycle of sectarian violence, which we saw in microcosm in Western Nineveh, and now you see broadly throughout the country. A cycle of violence in which the Baathist, some call it the Sunni-based insurgency, sets the conditions for the integration of al-Qaeda and the Takfirist element of the insurgency, which then conducts mass murder attacks against civilians, which then, because of the lack of security in some areas, justifies militias, which then in turn provides a rationale for the Sunni insurgency. So this is the cycle of violence which we continue to see throughout the country. Well, I know I'm going to go on too long if I keep talking like this, so I'm going to talk about how you take something like this apart. Okay, first of all, when you get into an area like this, You've got to focus, obviously, on the population. You have to go in with your ears open. You have to listen to various parties, but you have to have a fundamental degree of understanding of the dynamics within the region. There are a number of ways to do this. Read, but consult experts and have cultural experts come with you. We had a guy named Dan Bernard, who's a University of Chicago PhD, wrote a dissertation on the 1920 revolt against the British and focused specifically on Nineveh province and understood the tribal dynamics and had broad knowledge of this area and knowledge in depth as well. Came with us for our first 3 months. Ahmed Hashim came as well, a guy named Joel Rayburn. I think it's immensely important. He saved us months. You have to figure out not only the nature of your enemy in your area of operations and how they're operating, but you have to also figure out what the other sources of instability are. Those typically involve what are the local grievances that allow the population to invite in this insurgent element. And then you have to begin by increasing security in the area to embolden the population to cooperate with your forces and provide you with intelligence. And then at the same time, you have to address local grievances to such a degree as the security situation allows. The enemy's takeover of this area was very sophisticated. Not only did they terrorize the population, but they forced the collapse of security forces such that security forces were no longer representative of the population. They were reviewed as a Shia pure retribution, death squad type force. This is perfect if you're al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is perfect if you're insurgency. This is the kind of situation you want. They took over government services, shut off water to areas that did not cooperate with them. They took over the mosques, and I think Dr. Esposito talked about this. These were not imams who took over the mosques. These were laymen with 3rd and 4th grade educations who preyed on the most vulnerable people in society, who recruited adolescents who wanted affirmation, who abused them in the worst sorts of ways, oftentimes repeatedly sodomizing them, making them members of beheading cells and so forth. And then they kept the population cowed with mass murder attacks and making examples of anyone who wanted to reconcile between the various parties within the city. The communities then fell back in on themselves. Neighborhoods armed themselves. You had Shia militia, which of course then the Takfirist propagandists called the Badr Corps and so forth. And so it was a perfect setup, for the enemy. Improving security is the first step to then establishing relationships that lead to trust, which lead to intelligence within various parts of the community. It's important to defeat a well-established insurgent organization like this militarily. This is where I differ with Professor Hoffman. I don't think acknowledging the automotive revolution makes you less able to conceptualize counterinsurgency operations. And in fact, I think light forces often can possess what I call a raiding mentality that does not focus on area security and improving security for the population and tend to confuse activity with progress as a result. But in our area, we needed tanks and Bradleys and helicopters because there was an established defense within this community. And I think it's important to understand the sophistication and the military capability of this enemy, because oftentimes when you hear about various options being discussed about Iraq, they don't tend to address the enemy. In this case, the enemy had established deliberate defenses throughout the city. It was called the Battalions of the One True God was the particular organization here. They were organized into 4 battalions. Each of those battalions had a direct fighter cell, or direct action cell, really company plus size of about 250 fighters. They also had specialized cells for snipers, mortars, propaganda, kidnapping, and murder. Okay. All of whom were trained in this town, which had become a training base for foreign fighters brought into Syria. And then those cells that were trained in Tel Afar were then sent essentially down the Tigris River into Mosul. And if the Mosul attacks occurred about 2 months after Tel Afar was taken over by these terrorists. The defenses were very sophisticated, multiple IEDs, huge houses rigged for demolition. We learned a lot from the Marines on the sorts of defenses that were established in Fallujah that allowed us to template and understand these defenses better. And then what really helped us during our operation was information from the population. I mean, we were able to determine with a very high degree of fidelity where these IEDs were, where the car bombs, cars laden with explosives at intersections and courtyards were positioned, where even machine gun positions and anti-tank positions were established.